Hi everyone, it's QuickyBaby and welcome back to World of Tanks, and today I'm going to be rating all 117 Tier 8 and Tier 9 premium tanks. So sit back, relax, this is going to be the video for you if you want to know which premium tanks are worth spending your money on. So, firstly, the WZ-111. This vehicle, I'm putting it straight into the avoid section. This vehicle is just so much worse than so many other Tier 8 premium heavy tanks that I just don't really think it's worth it. It's a clone of an Alpine Tiger, and it does have preferential matchmaking, so that is a bit of a boost to it, but there's just no point in this tank, especially in 2023. Next up, the 112. I think this is a great performer. The extra gun depression that this vehicle has over the 111 really helps. It has an amazing lower plate as well that can bounce all Tier 6 and Tier 7 tanks unless they're firing gold. And I've used this vehicle to do some of the hardest heavy tank missions in the game. So this one, it's actually sleeper OP. Next up, the BZ-176. So early on into the list, it's going to be the first truly pay-to-win tank. 800 alpha on the premium rounds, more penetration on its premium rounds than its regular rounds, incredible armor, 10 degrees of gun depression, rockets which allow it to push through choke points. This is the be-all end-all of tanks, and we haven't seen it sold in the entirety of this year. So has this been a case of Wargaming making such an overpowered broken tank that unless they nerf it, they can't really sell it without truly saying that they don't care about their game anymore? Well, we'll just have to wait to see what 2024 brings. Next up, the 114. This is kind of in between a decent choice and an alright situational for me. If you don't mind bad gun handling, probably a decent choice. If you do, probably want to dump it in the alright situational. Nevertheless, it's just got a huge amount of hit points and a really nice accurate gun with decent standard and decent premium rounds. It makes credits. It's a tier 9. It's a friendly tier to play, more comfortable at least for me, or should I say more enjoyable at least for me than playing tier 8. So I like the 114. I'm going to put it in the decent choices section. Next up, Skoda T56. This one's right up in the pay to win section. This vehicle is a god tier tank, able to deal 460 damage twice. It's just an all-round easy tank to play, and considering this one's actually being sold, unlike the BZ-176, this is probably the one that you want to get your hands on, irrelevant of what player you are. Next up, the FCM50T. I'm going to put this thing into the avoid section. A 90mm gun just doesn't really do it anymore in 2023, and preferential matchmaking just isn't what it used to be. I think there are far better things you could be spending your money on, or even not spending your money on, as the case is with the Liberté. You can pick this thing up for bonds. I think it's 8,000 bonds to be able to get this, rather than actually having to spend money on something of one of these other worse premium tanks. And this thing is just super easy to play. Has all of its armor focused in the fronts. Just keep your front to your opponents. It's actually not able to be penetrated apart from in the weak point on top by a tank like the BZ-176, for example. And you'll be surprised with just how dependable and faithful the Amex M4 Liberté is. Next up, the Samoa SM. I'm putting this one into the super competitive section. If you're somebody who knows how to handle an autoloader, then it'll be dropping down to the great performer if you don't. This thing, it always just seems to perform for me. It's like 10 degrees of gun depression with a great 1,500 damage potential, and it has a better unload speed than something like a 5100. It's pretty much taking a 5100 and actually making it relevant for 2023. It's a very powerful tank, and you don't see too many of them out on the battlefield, but the ones that do seem to be doing a lot. Next up, the Lerva. It's between an alright situational decent choice. Since the vehicle has been buffed, it's just not a bad tank. And the only problem with the tank is there's just so many other vehicles that have gone into the game over the last 10 years since the Lerva was actually released that it stops it from being competitive inside the game. Next up, the Mauerbrecher. This thing is kind of between a decent choice, alright situational. If you're an incredibly good player, I think this tank will frustrate you. However, if you're a casual player who just wants to have thick armor and be able to just do some damage, this thing might be the one for you. It's like Wargaming trying to take a mouse and make it a tier 8 premium, and while it doesn't really work because of the huge weak point and the fact that the lower plate is much worse than the mouse, and the fact that if you overangle the cheeks that you do get pinned in the side of the turret, but this is good enough in quite a few situations. And the VK7501K is again going into the same bracket as the Mauerbrecher, and that is because while it's good at side scraping, outside of it, it is not very good at all. Nevertheless, it's still a decent tank and one of the best for when you do get it into its strong position. Next up, the E75TS. This is just a solid choice, if not a great performer. It's just nice for having all-round capacity on the battlefield. Decent armor, decent gun, decent mobility, fun for ramming, but I feel like its lower plate is just a little too weak, and the lack of, should we say, high alpha or autoloader to put it higher up on the list. Next up, it's a brand new one, the first tier 9 German heavy, the Tiger Mouse. So when this vehicle first came out, I thought it was either going to be a great performer or super competitive, but for me, I'm just going to put it in the decent choices section. It's definitely better than situational, and I don't think it's actually as great of a performer as I thought it was going to be. But if you use it well, and you don't have people spam very high penetration gold at your cheeks or hit your weak point or catch your lower plate, you make the gun work, yeah, this thing can really make your opponent sweat. Next up, the Passante. I love this tank. I want to put this into the super competitive section for me personally. However, let me clarify, if you are frustrated by poor gun handling, drop it down a notch. And if you don't know how to use auto reloaders, then drop it down another notch. But this is my list. I love this tank. I think it's just great for getting forwards, getting on a ridge line, and just controlling the situation. I never really feel that I'm truly helpless in a vehicle like this, unless I do need very high penetration to be able to get through the heavy tank that I'm locked in an engagement with. But you've got enough speed to dictate where you're going to go. I love this vehicle. Next up, you might be wondering, what is this tank? Well, this tank is actually called the Nameless, and it's only available on the Asia server. When the vehicle first went in, it was definitely towards the top of the list, but now this all-round Japanese heavy tank is probably just a decent choice, unless you absolutely want to get the Valkyria Chronicles crew that comes with it. Now, the Type 63, a brand new vehicle for 2023. This vehicle is an absolute enigma to place on this list, because in some ways, it is a performer, but when you need the damage per minute, it feels absolutely horrible. So for me personally, I'm going to put this in the alright situational section if you want to have something that's competitive and is going to farm you a lot of credits. However, if you just love sitting on a ridgeline and you love waiting and just sniping, then it's a very great performer, if not a decent choice. But for me personally, it just doesn't have the damage per minute and its hull armor is too frustrating to put it higher up this list. But when it does get to use its 12 degrees of gun depression and when it has enough time to work with its low damage per minute, this vehicle is half decent. Next up, the 50 TP prototype. This is a great performer. How can you go wrong with 10 degrees of gun depression over the side, less over the front, 440 alpha damage? It's just a solid Polish behemoth of the battlefield. Every time I get in this tank, it just seems to work. You can side scrape, although not perfectly. You can get on a ridge line, although not perfectly. The tank is not without its flaws, but it has so many great strengths that I couldn't put it anywhere lower on the list. Now another new tank, the 56 TP, and it's going right next to its brother. It's so similar, less alpha damage, poor damage per minute, but just so fast and so flexible, again on a ridge line as well. This tank, it's just decent. It gets places, it does its work. No one's really going to consider it being the most exciting tank inside the game, but it just works. Next up, the Emil 1951. I'm going to put this one in the decent choices section. It's just not quite the impact of a Skoda T56. And while when it gets to use its 12 degrees of gun depression, it does do very well. Playing a tank that is just so dependent on the kind of map that you get on can be very frustrating for a lot of players. Its bigger brother, the Tornvang, now that it has been substantially buffed a couple of months ago, has to go into the great performer section. This is just very decent tank. The problem is it's really boring. It's got a poor gun handling, it's inaccurate, it's got low damage per minute, and really you just got to hope that your opponents are going to expose themselves or try and push you in their frustration. But still, having a tank that can create that stalemate to force your opponents to have to do something if it can't manage to take advantage of weak points on their armor is a strength in itself. Next up, the Stridsvagn K. This vehicle's not great, and now that we're having better and better premium heavy tanks going at tier 9, it is wavering between the decent choices and the alright situational section for me. In fact, I'm going to put it in the alright situational. It's not a bad tank for sure. It's a tier 9 heavy. It was the first tier 9 premium inside the game. It can make bonds as well as credits at the same time. Wonderful. But now, vehicles like the Tornvang have been buffed, and now that you've got new Tier 9 heavy premium tanks going in the game, with competition from the Tiger Mouse and competition from the Object 752, I just feel like the Stridsvagn K's time in the limelight is dwindling significantly. Next up, the Carnarvon Action 10. This vehicle, like the Stridsvagn K, is starting to show its age, and unfortunately, while it does have very good damage per minute, its alpha damage is just not doing what it needs to do. Consequently, I'm putting it in the alright situational section. I think there are far better heavy tanks that you can spend your hard-earned cash on. Now, the Chieftain Prototype. This vehicle is just a solid tank to have on a ridgeline. For me personally, I'm going to put it in the Great Performer section, purely because it's just so darn consistent. And while its damage per minute can be a little bit frustrating, and if you do expose your hull, yeah, it's not going to be good news. They can still catch a smaller weak point on top of this tank, but you just 10 degrees of gun depression, a decent turret, just get everywhere, do everything. It's not going to ever feel like it's truly amazing, but it's very rare that it feels like it's completely useless. Now let's talk about the Charlemagne. This vehicle is going straight into the super competitive section. This vehicle, if you can get your hands on it, and it's currently been a ranked exclusive, is one of the best premium tanks in the game. It is a bit of a weirdo. It has horrible shell velocity, and you have to over-angle its well-angled side armor to be able to, when I say well-angled, it's because it bows out, so you can bait people into shooting it. Then this vehicle is fantastic, with its 10 degrees of gun depression and 440 alpha damage, and it's a very unusual one on the battlefield. And I wonder if one of the reasons why this vehicle is doing so well is because not a lot of people know about its capabilities. And when it goes to general release, maybe it's going to lose a little bit of that hidden advantage. Next, let's talk about the Caliban. For me, I'm going to put this in the Great Performer. However, for people out there who don't have patience, this is going down into alright situational, or it's going into a decent choice. I think this tank is great. Just load gold, and you do so much damage with its 600 alpha damage so consistently with super high 290 pen that it just grinds out whatever's in front of it. And also, it's kind of fun to just be able to dump 1,200 damage into something as you're going down at the end of the battle. Again, if you don't have patience, don't buy this tank. This vehicle requires you to have a steady hand, to hold those rounds, and to only fire it when it's fully loaded, because as soon as you fire the final shot, you'll have no damage per minute and be able to fight back. Next up, the Gonzalo. This vehicle is very solid, and it's going into the Great Performer section. However, unlike the Caliban, where I feel you need patience to be able to play it, you don't need it for the Gonzalo. It's just simple. You don't have to faff around with any auto reloader, so just fire when you're loaded, use the amazing high explosive rounds, and just start to pick apart your opponents. Next up, the T-34. I'm going to put this one in the alright situational section now. I think it's had its time. It was buffed about 5 years ago, but since then there are just more vehicles going into the game like the Tornvang that have just been buffed that just, I mean, why would you ever really want to play the T-34, which pains me to say. Now the Mutant. I hate this tank for so many reasons in so many ways. I don't think it has a fun playstyle, has a really annoying weak point on top, horrendous side profile, awful damage per minute. Bad alpha damage now at 320, but more importantly, this vehicle should have never have been available for everyone to purchase. It should have been an exclusive tank for people who spent $100 in World of Tanks. I didn't have $100 when World of Tanks first came out to spend on a free-to-play game, and so I don't deserve to have this one. And Wargaming made a fool out of everyone for selling it. They made a fool out of the people who originally supported their game. They made a fool out of everyone who bought this for like 50 euros, because it is not worth 50 euros. And they made a fool out of themselves for going back on a promise to have it as an exclusive tank. Next up, the Chrysler K. This vehicle is decent, if not a great performer. However, considering how awkward it feels with its lack of gun depression, especially when it's getting into top tier matchups, I'm going to put it in the decent choices section instead. Again, if you absolutely love to go into a town environment and side script, this might be the vehicle for you. For me, I find it a little bit boring and I just want to push the tempo against my opponents. Now let's talk about the Patriot. This thing has been substantially buffed, so it's going to be dropping into the decent choices section for me. However, you have to be willing to make 240 alpha damage work on this tank, and if you can't, you'd be better buying something else with more alpha damage like the Renegade. The Renegade is a high octane, high damage per minute tank that will farm you a lot of credits. It clearly goes into the great performer section. The only thing that sucks about this vehicle is that huge weak point on top. which will most likely end up frustrating the living daylights out of a lot of its owners. Now let's talk about the T-77. This vehicle, I feel I want to put it in the alright situational, but if you can manage to use an autoloader, it'll probably go into a decent choices section. It's just too darn frustrating to have a substantial reload after dealing hopefully 1,000 damage, but realistically you probably whiff 1 if not 2 of those 3 shells, kind of subjecting this thing to having one of the worst damage per minutes that's possible at tier 8. Now we'll talk about the M4Y. This vehicle is going into the avoid section for me. Wargaming thought that the reserve track mechanic was going to have a real big impact in World of Tanks, and it just didn't. It really didn't. You're still far better to get something like a Renegade and sacrifice just a little bit of the armor, and more importantly, sacrifice a little bit of the tracking capacity to be able to get all of that extra firepower. Now let's talk about the TS-54. If you can use an auto reloader, I think this will probably be in the great performance section. However, for everyone else, decent choices, if not alright situational. For me personally, I'm going to put it in the decent choices section. But funnily enough, I can't ever really find myself wanting to play this. I'd probably rather play something with a little bit more alpha damage that also has a double barrel. But it's a strong tank. But I have to admit, having to spend kind of like $8 a month or $9 a month or whatever it is on World of Tanks Plus just to be able to have this vehicle, that's not worth it. Now let's talk about the T-832. This thing's going into great performance for me. This is a very good example of where losing damage per minute to be able to gain finesse with regards to your gun is totally worth it. I do not mind sacrificing the damage per minute to have this laser pointer consistent gun, and I think that everyone will do well with the T-832. Next up, this is the T-54 Heavy, and this tank is going to yo-yo between the decent choices to the avoid section. If you're someone who can handle the fact that this has a horrible weak point, then it's probably going to be alright situational. And if you love playing tier 9 vehicles rather than playing lower tier vehicles, then you probably want to pick this one up just to be able to have access to the 100 bonds that you can farm with it each week. However, all in all, there are far better premium tanks that you can spend your money on, and so I would recommend it goes for me in the alright situational section, if not the avoid section for you if you hate weak points. Next up, KV-5. I absolutely love this tank. For me, it's got to go into the great performance section, if only for fun. I recommend you use a durability device on this vehicle, a turbo and bounty protection technology, and just push every single time at anything. Ram anything, go in and create some chaos, enable your team to make a play. This tank, if you're crazy and you can't help but have a little bit of fun by trying to make plays in World of Tanks, this will be the vehicle for you. Next, let's talk about the IS-6. This is truly a vehicle that has stood the test of time, and while its preferential matchmaking doesn't really mean what it used to back in the day, you still really can't go wrong with a tank that just has such darn good armor and can avoid playing tier 10s. And while it's not exactly a tank that I think a lot of people would be jumping to get their hands on, it's such a friendly tank with an easy playstyle that you really can't go wrong with an IS-6. Now let's talk about the IS-8, aka the Object 730. Sorry, I meant to say IS-5. This vehicle, irrelevant of what Wargaming do to this tank, now that they've given it 7 degrees of gun depression, they've made it substantially more flexible in a ridgeline, it just doesn't seem to really perform. The gun handling feels so bad, and it just prevents me from even beginning to recommend purchasing this inside the bond store. So while it's alright and situational, I'm probably going to put it in the avoid section. Don't waste your time with it. Now let's talk about the IS-3A. This one is yo-yoing between great performer and decent choice for me. I think I'm going to have to put it in great performer. You really can't go wrong with a vehicle that can store up 1,170 damage, blow it all in 6 seconds, and then be operating at peak performance. It's basically taking an auto-reloading mechanic from the Italian tanks and making it idiot-proof. So you just hold down your mouse button and keep holding it down. So it has all of the advantages and none of the disadvantages. The only problem is the IS-3 platform itself definitely isn't the best of tanks. But this thing, it still absolutely performs. Next up, the Kirvets. I'm putting this tank into the I hate it section for the reason why it was released into the game. It is the hull of an Object 703, which has been in the game for years, with basically an IS-3A kind of turret, but none of the auto-loading fun of the IS-3A, and also the fact that Wargaming charged 15 million credits for this vehicle, and you had to roll up to 5 million credits to be able to even have access to purchase it, is disgraceful. I still hate this tank, and I hate playing it purely because of how I got my hands on it. And even if you don't care about that, it's probably still only going to be around about the avoid and alright situational section. Next, let's talk about the defender. This is going into great performer. It stood the test of time. You can't go wrong with overpowered armor and 440 alpha damage, and still to this day, it is a strong tank to play. Following right into the great performance section will also be the Object 7032. I love this double barrel gun, and it used to be more in the super competitive section. You really can't go wrong with the 7032 if you're able to land your doubles. However, I think that this year it has been definitely punished a lot by the BZ176 and the Skoda T56 still remaining super powerful on top. Next, this is an unusual vehicle. This is the Adurni, which is available on the Asia server, but not available so far on the European server. This vehicle is super pay to win. And if Wargaming are going to sell this in 2024 or make it available in an event and they don't change the statistics from the Asia server, I would thoroughly recommend trying to get your hands on this vehicle, as it is outrageous what it's able to do with its amazing armor. Next, let's talk about the K2. This vehicle, for me, is really close between the pay-to-win and super competitive section. In fact, I'm going to put this in the pay-to-win section. But let me add a caveat, and that is that you really have to know what you're doing with angling your armor on this vehicle, because that is the tank's strength. If you angle your armor, you will render all tier 8 and below tanks incapable of dealing with you efficiently. However, unlike something like a BZ176, it doesn't really have very much firepower output. So you truly have to master the vehicle's armor if you want to be successful on the battlefield. So don't get this vehicle unless you're either up for a challenge or you're willing to spend some time learning the nuances with side scraping on this very powerful tank. Now let's take a look at the latest tier 9 heavy tank in the game. It is the Object 752. And this vehicle really snuck up on me. I think it is now the best tier 9 premium heavy tank that's inside the game. It has idiot-proof armor. All you really have to do is angle at like 40 degrees, and then you've got an autoloader capable of doing 1,170 damage. This thing is super powerful. If you manage to get your hands on it inside the loot boxes, congrats, give it a go. Just check out my full tank review. Make sure you aren't depressing the gun when you're not actually shooting at your opponents, which will hide your weak points, and you're good to go. Just get forwards, get clapping, and this thing can really tear through whatever is in front of it. The only real downside to the vehicle is how much ammunition it can carry. So unless you want to just take a lot of gold rounds and not think about that, which is okay for now, we're making 50% extra credits, but it might start to become a reality as to how little credits you make if you're playing a tank like that with full gold, especially if you're bouncing or missing a shell or two. Alright, that was all of the heavy tanks. Now we're going to be working our way through the mediums. First up, the 122TM. This thing is super competitive. It's only the damage per minute that stops this thing from being pay to win. It's an absolute performer. I would recommend this for every single player inside the game. If you're a good player, you'll still like all of its other attributes, like its accuracy, its 400 alpha damage, its 8 degrees of gun depression, and the vehicle's armor, as well as having nearly 300 heat pen. If you're a casual player, you'll like the fact that you have all of those, and you won't worry so much about the carry potential with the lack of damage per minute. It's a fantastic tank for everyone involved. Next, the Type 59. This is going in the great performance section for me. However, for a lot of players, it might go into the decent choices. It's just so well-rounded, and it definitely favors somebody who's going to play aggressively with this tank. If that's you, it's just solid. You really can't go wrong. It's so well rounded. It's like a T44-100 that has preferential matchmaking. So it's definitely got to go into the great performance section for me. Now let's talk about the T34-3. This one, I think it's yo-yoing between the great performers and the decent choice. It's only slightly behind the Type 59 in my estimations. Its alpha damage is nice at 390, but I think it'd be a bit silly to want to play this instead of a 122TM. The only advantage this vehicle has is it avoids tier 10 matchups, but you're going to be wasting so much ammunition on gold to when you are in those tier 9 matchups that I think it'd be crazy to want to get your hands on it. Next, let's talk about the 59 pattern. I'm not going to put this in the I hate it section because I've got nothing against it, but I would put it firmly in the avoid section. And when I say this goes in the avoid section, I truly mean it, boys and girls. This might be the worst tier 8 premium tank inside the game. It doesn't really have any redeeming qualities, and it has the world's biggest weak point on top. Do not waste your money on this vehicle. And I think Wargaming have even just given up trying to sell this tank because they know they don't want to disappoint people when they purchase it. Now let's talk about the Skoda T27. I'd love to love this vehicle. One of my favorite tanks in the game is the Skoda T50 at tier 9, and I love the tier 10 Czechoslovakian auto-loading medium as well, the TVP T50/51. But this vehicle at tier 8, it just doesn't really have any of that kind of flavor. It's 240 alpha damage every 1.8 seconds. It's not bad burst damage, but why would you ever want that when you could play a Borask? And unfortunately, I just would never recommend anyone buy this. But if you do, it's not the worst of vehicles, and you better be getting some good crew training out of it. Now let's talk about the Lorraine. The Lorraine is a decent choice, and considering it's available for bonds inside the store, will excite a lot of players. But be warned, if you buy this and you don't know how to really work with an autoloader, you might end up very disappointed. Now the CGC. I'm going to drop this in the avoid section, but if you're a very good player, you could probably make it work in some scenarios. Again, the 240 alpha damage just doesn't work, and it has absolutely no armor, and it's got a huge silhouette. If this vehicle was just a little bit smaller, maybe it'd be worth playing in some regards, and it's kind of a little bit hopeless to even consider the things that Wargaming could do with this tank. Next up, the Revelarice. This is going to go in the alright situational section for me. It's just got 390 alpha damage. The problem with the tank is that when you do get into tier 10 matchups, you are going to cry. I always seem to make the mistake of thinking this vehicle has preferential matchmaking, and I don't think it does. And I think that's just because I have so much optimism when I look at the Revelarice. I think it's the little tank that could. And while if you can't make 10 degrees of gun depression work in World of Tanks, there's probably something wrong with you. But I think there's a lot better vehicles you could be spending your money on. Next up, the Borask. This is going straight into the pay-to-win section. This vehicle is outrageously good. Incredible camo, 720 alpha damage, which it delivers in 2 seconds. It was one of the most enjoyable 3 marks that I've had this year. And boy, when you're sweating in this vehicle, almost feels like you're cheating. That's why it's going firmly into the pay-to-win section. Next up, the AMX-30 prototype. This vehicle, it's a great performer. This one, it's really hard to love because it doesn't have any features which really make you go, wow. But on the other hand, it's got hardly any features that really make you want to not play it. I think it's got 11 degrees of gun depression, a half-decent turret, half-decent hull, good penetration on its standard rounds and its premium rounds. It's not a bad tank. It's just very forgettable, which is why you probably don't see too many of them on the battlefield. Next up, the Panther 88. And this is weird because it's the tank with the highest damage per minute, I believe, of any of the tier 8 mediums. But it still just has no hull armor, no camo, no real mobility. Don't buy this one, boys and girls, even with its preferential matchmaking, which I just had to go and check, and it doesn't have. It's totally not worth purchasing. Now let's talk about the Panzer 58 Mutz. Again, this is going into the avoid section as well. There's just so many better things that you can spend your money on. However, if you are a good player, you can surprise your opponents with the high explosive rounds on this vehicle. But again, why would you ever want this when you could get a Kampfpanzer? This is a crazy high damage per minute vehicle. I'm putting it in the great performance section. The thing that stops it from going up into super competitive is this armor is just not great, especially on that turret. And 200 alpha damage sometimes just doesn't feel like you can trade very well. But you've got such a good rate of fire that hopefully you're firing multiple shells, right? Next up, the M48 Rampanzer. Again, wouldn't bother with this. It's a bit of a meme tank. Kind of can be a little bit fun to just play something that looks ridiculous and surprise a few of your opponents. But outside of a nice matchup, this vehicle's armor doesn't feel like it's all that special with the huge weak point. Wouldn't bother with it. Next up, the Mittlerer. I'd put this in a higher bracket to the Rampanzer. It's a half decent choice in World of Tanks. The issue is that its hydropneumatic suspension just feels really awkward and annoying. And even with it, it only gets 9 degrees of gun depression. So it's just not worth investing big money into a vehicle like this, in my humble opinion. Next up, the Progetto. I love this vehicle. It's close to being the super competitive or pay to win section for me. I'll probably put it super competitive because while it's very decent, and there's a reason why it's one of the most played premiums inside the game, its lack of alpha damage, penetration, armor, just hold it back a little bit. But everything else about the vehicle, apart from those 3 aspects, is very decent. How can you go wrong with doing 720 damage in 4 seconds of the first shot? Well, there's a tank that can do it in 2, right? Although with substantially worse accuracy and gun handling. Next up, the STA-2. This vehicle's in a decent choice for me. It's your only chance to be able to train up your Japanese medium tank crew, but it's just not very competitive in so many areas. Poor alpha damage, poor armor hold this vehicle back, but everything else about it's half okay. Next up, this is an unusual one, an Asia server exclusive, the Edelweiss. Again, just an all-rounder, definitely not as good as it used to be back in the day. I wouldn't really bother with this vehicle unless you specifically want the Valkyria Chronicles crew. Next up, the CS-52 Lease. This is a great performer. It's just a decent tank, 7 degrees of gun depression, 320 alpha damage, very decent premium rounds with great shell velocity and half-decent penetration. It's not a bad tank, it can just do everything on the battlefield. It's a solid performer in World of Tanks. Next up, the Prima Victoria. I would thoroughly recommend avoiding purchasing this vehicle unless you are a Sabaton fan. The advantage of having the Sabaton crew is great. The brothers in arms, they're fun, they have unique voice acting. Sabaton's a cool bunch of guys. However, if you want to get yourself a competitive vehicle inside the game, definitely wouldn't recommend this vehicle. Apart from having APCR as its standard rounds, it's just basically worse than the Centurion 5-1 in every single way. Do not buy this tank and waste your money on it. Next, let's talk about the Lansen. I am putting this thing in the super competitive section. I had 2 of my highest experience games of all time playing this vehicle. In fact, if you take away my Churchill 3 record of over 4,000 experience, the Lansen is in 2nd and 3rd place for all-time experience on my account. It's just this wonderful mix match of gun depression, high damage per minute, and a good amount of camo rating as well. And if you know what to do with that, especially with Equipment 2.0, you can do some magical things with this tank. And while it's not going to be everybody's cup of tea, if you are a decent player and who wants to play something that isn't frowned upon as a meta tank that some people won't know exactly how to play against a Lansen, this one might be the one for you. Next up, the FE4202. There's absolutely nothing wrong with this vehicle. It is fairly competitive in a hold down position. It's just there's nothing truly special about the vehicle. Used to be the tier 10 tier 10 tech tree tank, so you think it'd be absolutely incredible at tier 8, but it just doesn't really end up doing anything too special on the battlefield. Next up, a vehicle that I think was just new for this year or last year, probably last year I'd say, it is the T95 Chieftain. This is one of the worst vehicles that you'll ever get, and the fact that it's got a chieftain in the name is almost insulting. The penetration is horrendous, the gold pen is horrendous, the weak point on the top horrendous, the camo rating, because it's a very tall tank, horrendous. Do not buy this tank. It will absolutely demolish your sanity and also your win ratio. Next up, the Centurion 5-1. This is a very decent tank. It's going in the great performers for me. This is probably one of the best vehicles for the casual player who wants to play something British. The improved upper hull armor will be forgiving when you're exposing it, especially on a ridgeline if you slightly overpoke. And then you just got a decent gun and a decent turret. You really can't go wrong with a vehicle like that. Next up, the GSAW 1010. All right, look, if you want my serious opinion on this vehicle, it's probably going to go in decent choice. It's not bad, okay? The 360 Alpha is good, the gun handling is good, the vehicle's pretty fast, but I'm going to be putting it in the I hate it section because this vehicle for me has so much potential to be so fun, and yet it's amazing for me that Wargaming have somehow made all of the British wheeled medium tanks this year so darn frustrating and disappointing. How can you have more potential than British wheeled medium tanks for fun inside the game? And Wargaming have somehow managed to make them some of the most frustrating and unexciting vehicles in the game that basically just have to sit at a decent distance and just punish foes that advance at them. Not only is it not really my thing, it's also not really performing very well in the bottom half of win ratio difference for all players. And interestingly enough, while it's doing a half decent amount of damage, it's not winning many of its games. And that's because it's a very selfish vehicle. Next, let's talk about the Super Pershing. This vehicle is a decent choice, if not a great performer inside the game. You can't go wrong with a vehicle that this one definitely does have preferential matchmaking. And since it's been buffed and buffed and buffed, as long as you're willing to bring on the gold rounds when you're playing against tier 8 and tier 9 tanks, it's just not bad. Next up, the Ripper pattern. This one's firmly going into the avoid for me. Even though it is an M46 Ripper pattern, it doesn't have any of the fun of tier 9. It's basically a Pershing, and while the Pershing has been buffed at tier 8, this one, it hasn't. Next up, the T25 Pilot. I'm putting this one in the avoid section as well. There are far better tier 8 medium tanks that you could be purchasing. However, if you absolutely must have an American medium, I guess the T25 Pilot does have some redeeming qualities, as you do sacrifice armor to be able to gain firepower potential. Also, the T42, going to be going in the avoid section, just feels like a waste. As while it is slightly better than the Ripper pattern and the T25 Pilot, there are still better vehicles that you can spend your money on. Like the TL7. This one, I'm going to put it in the alright situational because it does come with the Offspring crew, so at least that's a saving grace. Apart from that, you'd be a fool to spend your money on a vehicle like this when you could buy the next two or three vehicles. Firstly, the Astron Rex. This is an incredible tank that I'm going to put in the pay to win section this year, because after playing it substantially since 2012, or should I say 2022, oh my god, where has the last 10 years gone? I figured out that its combination of armor with its auto-loading potential, it has better damage per minute than a tier 10 medium tank when it's fully unloading, although with a 4-second intra-clip reload and then a substantial 30-second cooldown, it can be frustrating in that regard. I don't think there are many, if any, better tier 8 medium tanks for you to be able to get your hands on. And interestingly enough, this one isn't really popular like the Progetto or the Borask, so some people won't even know how to play against it. The only thing I would say is this one is definitely more cruise skill dependent, and I would recommend having a bounty aiming device on this vehicle to improve its horrible accuracy. But if you can afford to get those things, I don't think you can get much better than the Astron Rex. Next, let's talk about the AMBT. This one's going straight into the super competitive section. However, if you struggle with auto reloaders, you might want to drop it down to your own personal great performer. This is just a wonderful tank. APCR rounds as standard, and on its premium rounds as well. You can do 360 damage every 3 seconds, fire one by one, or just dump all of the shells out without reloading. It is a powerhouse of the battlefield and scales very well if you're willing to work on your crew skills and put some bond equipment on this vehicle. In the same section, we'll be dropping the Iron Arnie as well. 3 marked this vehicle this year, and it was an easy one to do. 300 millimeters of gold pen on this thing. Good speed for a medium tank, as good if not better armor than any heavy tank at tier 8. This thing just loves to sit on a ridgeline and punish its opponents. The only downside to this vehicle is that it doesn't have very good damage per minute, so if you're someone who wants to try and snowball the battle and earn a lot of credits very quickly, then this one isn't going to be the one for you. Next up, the T54 Mod 1. This one's dropping in decent choice for me. Every year that goes by, more and more tanks have more and more alpha and more penetration, and a vehicle that relies on its armor like the T54 Mod 1 slowly becomes less and less special. Nevertheless, it's still hanging in there, and it's not a bad choice for anyone wanting to be able to make use of their armor while still playing the medium class. Next up, the T44-100. It's going in the decent choice section as well. It sacrifices armor compared to the T54 Mod 1 to be able to gain some mobility and gain some firepower capacity. But again, just like the T54 Mod 1, there are better medium tanks going into the game that you could pick. Why would you ever play this when you could play one of the any one of the super competitive or pay to win section medium tanks? But for somebody who really wants to have it all on the battlefield, but just not have a lot of having it all, then the T44-100 might be the one for you. Next up, let's talk about the Guard. This one is flipping between the great performer or decent choices for me. I'd probably put it in the decent choices section. The gun on this thing is great. 122 millimeters, very accurate, fully traversable turret, good camo rating on the vehicle, and the only thing that really holds it back is its gun depression and its armor. But if you're willing to work with that, this is not a bad tank. Next up, the 274A. This is either in the decent choices or great performer. When this vehicle first came out, I thought it was absolutely god tier incredible, but as the years pass, this vehicle just becomes less and less inside the game. If you don't mind the RNG effect with a vehicle like this, you might want to put it into the great performer section, but for a lot of people, this will feel a little bit slow and you'll want to be playing something else. Next, let's talk about the Obsidian. For me, this is going straight into the great performer section. However, it is a very matchmaking dependent tank. If you play against tier 9s and tier 10s, your armor won't nearly be so special and you'll get very frustrated having to spam a lot of very expensive gold with only 200 alpha damage. However, when you get against tier 6, tier 7 and tier 8 opponents, there is very little that a lot of tanks can do. This thing is freakishly troll, and it's also been the best opportunity probably of all time to be able to get a full-blooded tier 8 premium tank for playing relatively fun, although some people thought it was boring, PvE game mode for about 10 or 15 hours over 10 days. This was an absolute steal steal for all of the free-to-play players out there to get a great performing tank for very little time invested. So that was all of the medium tanks. Now let's move on to the light tanks. Firstly, the M41D. This vehicle, it's just a decent choice. There's nothing wrong with this vehicle. There's nothing right with this vehicle. It does have really nice view range, scarily good view range, so you definitely won't need coated optics on this thing unless you want to go overkill view range, which allows you to invest into things like vents, exhaust, and a vision system map dependent. This thing, it's quite nice how different it feels with the different builds, and you have got two, so it's quite nice to go for a firepower build and a pure scouting build. From that perspective, it's a good tank. But can I ever really say that I've ever truly wanted to play this vehicle? Probably not. Now let's talk about the ELC Even 90. This is one of the most despicable tanks in the game, in my opinion. And if you want my real opinion, this is either a great performer, super competitive, or pay to win, depending on how good of a player you are. But I'm going to put it into the I hate it section, because I just despise everything about this vehicle. It is game-breakingly annoying to play against this tank. They could sit in any bush, and you would have to go and proxy spot them or blind fire them to 50 meters. But when you've got a tank that's this small, and it could literally knock down a tree and then use a tiny little bit of foliage to hide its entire tank from you, it could be anywhere on the map, which isn't bad on a map like Himmelsdorf, for example. But when you're playing on Prokhorovka-Ensk, it just truly feels as if, oh, they've got a good ELC, or the game's done already. And scarily enough, there are more ELC Even 90s played than pretty much all of the other Tech Tree Tier 8s combined in the last 30 days. And as the years go by, I just feel like a tank like this becomes more and more of a problem, and Wargaming just don't seem to care about it. Now let's talk about the EBR-75. This vehicle is the best Tier 8 light tank. It's going into the pay-to-win section for me. The only thing that keeps this thing balanced is it has to meet a wheeled vehicle on the enemy team. However, seeing how it's been years since the EBR-75 was sold, it's more a case of the Lynxes have to feed the EBR-75s now. And even though this tank is meant to be an active scout, it's actually doing more damage than any of the other Tier 8 light tanks inside the game. It's a filthy tank. If you can manage to get your hands on it, if Wargaming lose their marbles and decide to sell it again, you should definitely. But it'll probably be the World of Tanks end times before Wargaming is selling a vehicle like this, because it will rain hell upon the matchmaker. Next, let's talk about the Char 75. I would love to put this into the pay-to-win section. But here's the thing, it's actually quite a complicated light tank to play, and unless you're a very good player, this thing will probably end up frustrating you. However, I'm going to put it in the super competitive section for me. Honestly, the Char 75 is one of the most fun tanks inside the game, and it's one of 5 vehicles that I would keep on my account if I was forced to delete the other 695 different vehicles. This thing is so fun for ramming, it's so fun for bullying, and being able to do 1,200 damage in quick succession to a wide variety of vehicles is just such a ridiculous thing to be able to do. And it's not the best scout, it's not a half bad scout. And this was one of the most fun tanks I played throughout the year. I played it lots, and the fact that it makes credits as well means it's just a win for this tank. All right, next up, let's talk about the HWK. This vehicle it's just a decent choice for the same reason as the M41D. There's just nothing truly special about this tank, but there's also nothing truly horrendous about this tank. It's not something that I would recommend people buy, but if you want to have something for frontline, there are worse tanks that you could purchase. Now let's talk about the M4190. This vehicle's pretty much in the same region as the Hawk. It used to be incredibly good, but as time goes on, there are just better and better vehicles going inside the game. And while this vehicle's damage dealing capacity is profound, there's just other vehicles which I would recommend purchasing. However, it's not its brother, the T92. This one's going in the alright situational section for me. I actually had one of the biggest games of the year in this tank, but it was just a case of everyone just sat in the open for me. But if that happens, you can work around this vehicle's horrendous 150 alpha damage, and it kind of quickly ramps it up. But this lack of alpha damage and no armor on this vehicle, there's just too many horrible things that the other aspects don't make up for. Next up, let's talk about the Senlak. This vehicle is not bad. It's definitely a decent choice. If not, it's a great performer. The Senlak has been buffed in the last couple of years. It has decent high explosive rounds, decent premium rounds, and the real problem for the tank is it's quite large for a light. And so when you get on a map like Prokhorovka or Malinovka, you're going to struggle compared to, you guessed it, the ELC Even 90. However, for when you get on those kind of city maps or the more damage support maps, it's not bad, and I would still recommend it. Next up, LT432. Whoop! Easy, straight into the super competitive section for me. This thing's armor really allows it to punch above its weight, combined with half okay gun depression, a great rate of fire. This thing is just an absolute cockroach of the battlefield, and I think everyone who's looking for a tier 8 premium light tank should consider the LT432. All right, that was all of the light tanks. Now we're going to be moving on to the tank destroyers. Firstly, the WZ-120, straight into the great performer section. But what more do you need? Mobility, armor, good gun, 340 gold pen, I believe. 440 alpha damage isn't exactly special for a tier 8 tank destroyer, but its rate of fire makes up for that. The only thing that truly sucks on this vehicle has to be the gun handling. But considering that you can get 40% camo when you're moving on this vehicle if you elect to use an exhaust, this thing's just an all-purpose monster of the battlefield. Next up, the WZ-120GFT. This is a tier 9 Chinese premium tank destroyer, and it's a real weird one to try and decide about how good it is. I actually have really, really good results in this tank. It's like a Jagdtiger gun performance, and then while it doesn't have Jagdtiger armor, it's sneaky and it's mobile to be able to deal it. For me, this has to go into the super competitive section. However, it's hard to say when hardly anyone are actually playing the vehicle. So maybe I'm lucky that I'm one of the only people who actually bother to play this tank. And in the last 30 days, it's only been in 800 battles on the European server, meaning that it's only in 25 battles per day. So nobody really cares about this tank. I'll be surprised if Wargaming are going to try and market it again. But if they do, this is actually probably one of the best tier 9 premiums in World of Tanks. So next up, the TVP 100 Shpatuk, whatever you want to call this thing. This is a great performer. The flexibility and the great ammunition that this vehicle has with brilliant AP, overpowered heat pen, and amazing high explosive make this a formidable opponent. This thing is also incredibly good for frontline, so if you have an opportunity to pick one up at a reasonable price, I would thoroughly recommend considering it. Next up, the CDA. This is going between the decent choices or right situational, probably the alright situational for me. I wouldn't recommend this vehicle. Its armor is okay, its gun depression is okay, its gun is okay, everything about the tank is okay, and while you can surprise your opponents, unless you get it for a very meaty discount, this one is just not worth it. Next up, it's a tale of two Jagdtigers. Firstly, the Jagdtiger prototype. This vehicle just hit the European server this year. It was an Asia server exclusive last year. And I'm going to put this thing in either the great performer or super competitive section. For me, I'm going to put it in the super competitive section. This thing just feels crazy good. I would have never realized how good the Jagdtiger's armor was against tier 6 tanks until the Jagdtiger prototype, of course. Now, you recognized it with the Jagdtiger 88, which I've actually just dragged instead of the Jagdtiger prototype there. But with the Jagdtiger 88, you never had a gun that truly felt fearsome to those low tier tanks. And while the Jagdtiger 88 has preferential matchmaking and it does meet tier 6s and tier 7s more than the Jagdtiger Proto, I would far rather be playing the Proto against 8s and 8s and below. And considering that with the Jagdtiger prototype, when you do play against those 9s and those 10 tanks, that you can just dab the 2 key and have over 300 millimeters of penetration, it is a fabulous vehicle. The Jagdtiger prototype is either going into decent choices or great performers section. It depends on the matchmaker. If you're getting against 8s and 9s, great, decent choices. If you're getting against low tiers, it's a great performer. I think for most people, it's going to be a decent choice because they aren't going to have the confidence to work around the vehicle's horrible armor layout for its low alpha damage gun. Let me clarify, there's no hypocrisy here. The Jagdtiger prototype has the same armor as the Jagdtiger 88, but with the Jagdtiger prototype, you got 490 alpha damage. With the Jagdtiger 88, you got 240. So you need to fire over 2 times to break even compared to the prototype, which means you have to expose yourself vastly more in the Jagdtiger 88, which is the downfall of the vehicle. All in all, if you want to have only one of these 2 tanks, definitely get the Jagdtiger prototype. You'll have much more fun with it. Now it's a tale of 2 Kanonen Jagdpanzers, one with a 90mm and one with a 105mm. I'm going to put the one with the 90mm into the avoid section. It hasn't been sold in such a long time, but it still just doesn't really work out. That 90mm is a pain to play with, especially when you get into the tier 10 matchups. The one with the 105mm, it's a little bit better. I'll put it in the alright situational section. It can be a nice sniper, but I'd question, why wouldn't you just go play a medium tank if you want to have that kind of a role? there are medium tanks like the Charioteer that pretty much have the same combat performance as the the Kanonen Jagdpanzer with the 105mm, but the Charioteer, for example, has a fully traversable turret and access to amazing high explosive rounds. I wouldn't recommend either of these two vehicles. Next up, let's talk about the Scorpion. This thing, it's either great performer or decent choice. If you're somebody who wants to sit and just use that alpha damage to be able to punish your opponents at long range, great performer. For somebody who wants to be a little bit more active, probably in a decent choice. For me personally, as somebody who wants to be active, I'm going to put it in the decent choices section. All right, now the T3 Jaeger. This is the first tier 9 premium German tank destroyer. And boy, this one's going into the avoid section. I'm not going to say I hate this tank because it is a tier 9 German premium tank destroyer, but it's so close to going into the I hate it section. This thing is awful, boys and girls. Wargaming have somehow managed to put a tank destroyer in the game that it feels just worse than playing a tier 8 tank destroyer at a higher tier. It doesn't have the DPM. It doesn't have the alpha damage. It's got less alpha damage than the Scorpion G does at tier 8. And it's as if they've tried to create like a Grilla down at tier 9, but just give it none of the fun. They could have easily given this thing the same alpha damage as a WT Alpha Panzer IV, for example, at 560, or given it something like 600 alpha damage and just made its rate of fire really bad. But no, we've got this super accurate tank, which is comfortable with the turret, but I just can't imagine anyone actually wanting to buy it. Now let's talk about the Viper. This is going into the super competitive section. I think this year, considering that we've had the Kari and the Jagdtiger prototype go into the game, previously I would have put the Viper into the pay-to-win section. But now that there are other super heavy tank destroyers that are competing with this vehicle, I think that its time in the true pay-to-win section is over. The Viper is still just an absolute smashing tank to play. Can you believe it's got 2,000 damage in its magazine? Although it does take 24 seconds to be able to deliver that magazine. But you've got all the armor that you need to just sit there, even on a ridgeline with great gun depression, to be able to deliver it. It is a very easy tank to play. I don't think it's going to be the most fun play style. A lot of people find the Italian tank destroyers boring, but irrelevant of what player you are and how good you are at the game, you will do well in this vehicle. Now let's talk about the Kari, the first Japanese tank destroyer, and it's a very good one to boot. This thing's 500 alpha damage and decent structure armor that's very useful against tier 6, tier 7, and tier 8 opponents. Really surprised me with how good this vehicle is. It's yo-yoing between the pay-to-win and the super competitive section for me. I'll probably put it in the super competitive section. You really can't go wrong with this vehicle for consistency inside the game, and I think its only downside is that I feel like it just doesn't have very much of a soul. But maybe I'm just being weird. Whenever I play this tank, I don't really feel special. However, when I'm playing the Jagdtiger prototype for some reason, even though I've got less alpha damage, I feel like, I'm a Jagdtiger. So maybe I'm just biased. But it's still going in the super competitive section because irrelevant of how the vehicle makes me feel, I can't deny that it's an incredible performer inside the game. Now let's talk about the Stridsvagn S1. This one, I'm split between putting it in the decent choices and the great performer section. I think for somebody who just wants to literally sit and they don't mind playing a 10-15 minute game of World of Tanks and just do as much damage as they possibly can from one position, great performer. However, for somebody who wants to be a bit more active, and I am the person who wants to be a bit more active, I'm going to put it in the decent choices section instead. It's not a bad vehicle. It's got, I think, the highest penetration of any of the tier 8s, and for that's a wonderful accolade to have inside World of Tanks. But there's more and more tanks going in with more and more DPM, more and more alpha damage, and it feels like you'd have to have armor now to truly be super competitive at tier 8 tank destroyer. And let's talk about a tank with armor. Wargaming, what are you doing? To the Turtle this year, they took a vehicle that was fine. It was a great performer or a decent choice last year, and they buffed it to the extreme. And now the Turtle has the best win ratio of any of the tier 8 tank destroyers, and it also has the best win ratio difference of any of the tier 8 tank destroyers. Wargaming buffed its top speed limit by 5 kilometers an hour, they buffed its penetration, and I think they might have addressed its gun handling a little bit as well. All of these things have taken a tank that was perfectly balanced to just being outrageously overpowered, and if you can manage to get your hands on this vehicle, I would thoroughly recommend it. The only thing I would say is that it's just a little bit boring after a while. And outside of those close quarters combat situations which really get your blood pumping, you better be prepared for the cooldown of driving around at still 25 or 30 kilometers an hour, whether you want a turbo, trying to chase down damage in the latter parts of the battle. Next up, the G-Saw 1008. This thing is going into the super competitive section. This vehicle, 1,280 damage within 6 seconds of the first shot, fully traversable turret. And now that we have experimental equipment in the game, I can think of hardly any better contenders than for your tier 3 mobility equipment on this vehicle, which will help the gun handling as well. You could stack that up with vents and a rotation device on this vehicle. As long as you've got a good crew, your view range won't be that bad on certain maps. And then you've got a super fast damage dealer that will just come in, blitz its opponents down, especially with gold, and probably even scurry away from them with incredible flexibility. Next up, the TS5. Again, going in the super competitive section. This is a fantastic, just I don't care tank for playing on a map. All you do in this vehicle is you take a gun rammer, durability, and a turbo, and you hold down your W key until you start to fight some heavies, and then you hold down your left mouse button until they die or you do. But because you've got great armor, decent hit points, and you've also got incredible damage per minute, it's quite often that they are dying more than you are. And that is why this vehicle is packing a great win ratio, irrelevant of the quality of player who's playing it. This is one of the best tanks for anyone to play. And the only thing I would like to say is that I think that very good players will do better in other tank destroyers that I've put in the super competitive pay to win section. Next up, the XM66F. This is a new vehicle. I don't think it's super competitive. I think the penetration on this vehicle definitely keeps it balanced, as well as the hull armor. For me, it's got to go into great performer. Every time I've played this tank, I've managed to make it work on the map. And I think a lot of people are just overcomplicating this tank. It's really simple. You just try and get on a ridgeline and just try and outgrind your opponents. It's that simple. That's all you've got to do on this vehicle. So if you were lucky enough to be able to get yourself one, don't give up on this vehicle. Go and watch my tank review. Put it on ridgelines and you'll be surprised with what it can do. Next up, the TL7. This is a tier 9 American auto-loading tank destroyer that was an Asia server exclusive until this year. And for me, it's got to go into the great performers section. Again, this is a vehicle that scales very well with the kind of equipment that you use on it. If you picked the bond rotation device, this is a great contender for this tank. In addition, the tier 3 mobility device will compound that to prevent the bloom after firing. And then you can dump in 4 360 alpha damage shells very quickly into your opponents. I think one of the reasons why this tank isn't doing better is because there are a lot of casual players playing it who are just frankly not setting it up correctly. So if you can get your hands on this tank, definitely invest into setting it up into a sweaty fashion and you'll be surprised at what it can do. Okay, next I noticed I've made a little bit of a mistake and the KV-4 Kraslavsky was put in the tank destroyers section accidentally. But I'll review it here anyway. So the KV-4 Kraslavsky, I'm going to put this in the alright situational section because it can side scrape and I like to set this thing up like I set up my KV-5. I use durability device with turbo and bounty protection technology, drop the repair kit so I can use the speed governors to go and take it to my opponents. However, this vehicle just doesn't have the damage per minute of the KV-5 and it doesn't feel like it has that KV-5 soul driving around the battlefield. So I would skip out on this one and pick up the KV-5 instead. Next, let's talk about the KV-4 KTTS. Now this one's an interesting one because I checked the statistics and it actually has some of the worst statistics of any of the tank destroyers with regards to win ratio, but I think everyone's wrong. They just don't know how to play it. For me, it's going in the great performance section. This is a very powerful tank destroyer. It's really simple. You take durability with a turbo and then you choose either gun rammer and vents and you take it to fight the heavy tanks. Do not sit at long range sniping in this tank. Go in, brawl, side scrape, mess your opponents up, and use the fact that you've got pretty big armor, at least in a nice matchup, unless you're dealing with tier 9s with gold and tier 10 tanks, with or without gold, and just bruise the heavies. And if you do that, you will do very well in this vehicle. However, unless you're a little bit crazy, you might want to skip on this one. Next up, let's talk about the ISU 130. Okay, this is going straight into the avoid section. I believe this is an Asia server exclusive and only, I think, super testers have it on the European server or the NA server. I think it was sold once. I would not recommend this. While it does have very interesting premium rounds that have more alpha damage, but they have far less penetration. which means that this thing doesn't have the penetration for tier 9 or tier 10 matchups. And so while it does do very well when it's against the tier 6, 7s and the 8s, just struggles when it's in the bad matchups, and I would not recommend this tank. You'd be far better to get the ISU 152K instead. This vehicle's kind of hilarious because Wargaming took the BL10 off a tech tree tank because I guess they considered it was too good, and then they sold it back to us 2 years later as a premium tank. However, the ISU 152K, it's just not doing... World of Tanks isn't the same like it used to be. There are crazy scouts whizzing around, they've got better equipment to be able to spot you and dig you out, and the ambush potential of the old school ISU 152 is not repeated with the ISU 152K. So I'm putting this in the alright situational section, because hell, when you hit for 750, boy does it feel good. It's just really annoying when you get trolled and your shells miss. Next up, the T103. This thing is available for bonds inside the bond store, and just for that, it's going up into the decent choices section. It's basically the Soviet version of a Scorpion, but what it lacks in finesse, it makes up for with its turret armor. Now, it does have less alpha damage at 440, but this thing still gets really good penetration on its gold rounds, and that fully traversable turret will allow you to be very flexible on a ridgeline, and that turret armor makes this thing really nice against 6s and 7s, not so good against 8s, 9s and 10s, but for something that you can buy for bonds and is so comfortable, it's a great tank for just making credits for anyone in World of Tanks. And ladies and gents, boys and girls, it's the final of the 117 vehicles that I am doing these mini reviews on today. It is the SU-130PM. This vehicle for me, I'm putting it in the great performers. I think this is better than the Scorpion and it's better than the T103. However, I'd like to add the caveat that considering you can get the T103 for bonds, I think you should buy that instead of actually spending real money on either the Scorpion or the SU-130PM. The SU-130PM has the higher alpha damage of the comparison and also gets really good heat. It's also very much more sneaky. So if you're the kind of player who wants to avoid getting hit in the first place, then this will be the better tank, unlike the T103, which wants to use that turret armor to grind its way to hopefully surviving its opponent's wrath. Anyway, ladies and gents, boys and girls, congratulations to you if you made it all the way to the end of this video. I really hope this list was useful for you and hopefully saves you lots of money in 2024 so you don't waste it on tanks that might not give you the best results. But let me clarify once again, this is my list and my recommendations based on my play style. So your results may vary. So while you can use it as a guide, go with your heart, go with your soul, and pick the vehicles that you think will make the most sense to you. Anyway, I really hope the effort was worth it. This video takes me a long time to do. If it was, make sure you give the video a thumbs up, but if you hated it, give it a thumbs down. And let me know in the comments, what tanks do you agree and disagree with my choices? And also, let me know in the comments if you want me to do this for tier 10 tech tree tanks this year as well, to let you know which ones to try and focus on and grind towards. And that about does it. Good luck to all of you. Have a wonderful Christmas time if you celebrate Christmas. Have some amazing holidays if you don't. And as always, thank you so much for watching. You've been epic and hopefully I'll see you soon.